The dominant narrative around Mercedes in Formula 1 recently has rightly focused on the frankly obvious shortcomings of its 2022 car. A bucking bronco that Lewis Hamilton says wants to kick you hard whenever you dare ask it to attack an apex. Okay, there have been one or two highlights. Pole for George Russell in Hungary, Hamilton nearly winning the US Grand Prix, and it's worth remembering Mercedes only trails Ferrari by 40 points in the Constructors' Championship, despite having a generally much slower car thanks to solid reliability and consistent point scoring. But as F1 heads towards its final 2 races of the season and the winter break fast approaches, it's time to look ahead. And for Mercedes, that means working hard to produce a better car that's lighter, more efficient, and able to produce more downforce without being run so stiff and so low to the ground that it gives the drivers headaches every time they hit a bump. Building a better car for 2023 is obviously top of the Mercedes Christmas wish list. Catching up the 8 to 10 months Toto Wolff estimates his team has lost to Red Bull in terms of car development, having spent so much time troubleshooting W13, is surely not far behind. But there's one prevailing weakness within the Mercedes operation that won't be fixed by building a better car, and that's what we're going to discuss in this video. After the surprise pole of Hungary and the near misses of Zandvoort and Austin, Mercedes identified Mexico City as perhaps the team's last best hope of avoiding a first winless campaign in Formula 1 since 2011. Mercedes were fast in Mexico, and hopes were raised of an epic battle for victory with Red Bull. But those hopes were dashed. Verstappen ran away with the race, Russell failed to even make the podium, and Mercedes was left to rue an opportunity lost. Now, it's possible Verstappen's Red Bull was simply too fast anyway, but that doesn't mean Mercedes couldn't have put up a better fight and maybe achieved a better overall result. Tyre strategy was key here, and the one Mercedes chose was so conservative that it surprised Red Bull. But it shouldn't have. For all there is to admire about the record-breaking Mercedes operation, strategy is not something this team has ever really shown mastery of. Mexico was just the latest example of what appears to be an over-reliance on simulation, a lack of foresight, and a lack of agility in reacting to events as they unfold. Even inside the cockpit of W13, travelling at well over 200 miles an hour and devoid of numbers to crunch when determining his thinking, George Russell could see what was patently obvious to people watching the race, but apparently not to his own team. Ferrari gets mocked for having a plan for every letter of the alphabet, but Mercedes steadfastly refused to do anything other than Plan A. Russell wanted to switch to the medium soft tyre strategy that Daniel Ricciardo used to such dazzling effect in hauling his McLaren to a best of the rest finish behind the big 3 teams. But it seems the Mercedes computer said no, and that was that. This is the same computer that before this race started couldn't even conceive of the strategy Red Bull pulled off to win so comfortably. And once racing got underway, Mercedes was convinced Red Bull would need to stop twice, failing to recall the fact Hamilton himself managed to win the 2019 Mexican Grand Prix with a one-stop strategy not too dissimilar to Verstappen's, using tyres that weren't as robust as this season's. Verstappen was actually told to speed up to get his medium tyres working properly after his pit stop, in a car that generally energises its tyres harder than the Mercedes does. He wasn't being told to manage them carefully to the end. Surely that should have set alarm bells ringing on the Mercedes pit wall. But no. Rather than react and throw absolutely everything at trying to break its 2022 victory duck, Mercedes instead passed up several opportunities to roll the dice. This was disappointing, but it's hardly surprising. Mercedes has often appeared conservative and too rigid in its strategy choices, particularly in the season since its early hybrid dominance, when it's had to consider what others are doing rather than simply trying to avoid favouring one of Hamilton or Nico Rosberg in an internal struggle. During those 3 seasons from 2014 to 16, when Hamilton and Rosberg were battling exclusively for the World Championship, internal relations became so toxic that Mercedes even had to regulate engine mode use just so one didn't feel disadvantaged against the other during a particular stint. In the years since, Ferrari and Red Bull have complicated things further for Mercedes, and many times they've been found wanting, even to the point where head of strategy James Vowles has had to apologise to Hamilton during a race for bungled strategy. Sometimes Mercedes does go aggressive, like in the 2021 Spanish Grand Prix, and when they do, often it works, but even then you still sense a reluctance to go against the grain. Perhaps they have simply become too used to strategising to protect winning positions, and so the culture now struggles to think clearly about how to turn losing positions into winning ones. Toto Wolff described the Mexican Grand Prix as a learning curve for Mercedes, and although there's always room for improvement, you'd expect a well-oiled winning machine like Mercedes to be a bit more on top of race strategy. Hindsight is always perfect, of course, but even in real time, there appeared a few obvious things Mercedes could have done differently. For example, why didn't Mercedes seriously consider starting at least one of its cars on the faster soft tyre, splitting strategies to afford it some extra flexibility early in the race, and therefore automatically complicating Red Bull's own strategic calculations? Verstappen and Perez were 2 of 8 drivers to start the race on softs, so it wasn't a complete outlier choice, even though it wasn't favoured by the majority. Both Ferraris also started on the soft tyre, but weren't in the fight due to engine problems, so Mercedes enjoyed the added luxury of no pressure from behind. Mercedes argues starting that race on a different compound to Red Bull actually constituted an aggressive move, but in reality, everything Mercedes did in this race was defensive. They stopped Hamilton early to cover Perez and protect second place, rather than trying to apply pressure to Verstappen. They stuck to plan with Russell, even though there was no threat from behind and it was obvious he needed to try something different to have any chance of beating Perez to the podium. Maybe Hamilton and Russell couldn't have made the medium tyre last as long as it needed to, but even so, the decision to fit hard compound Pirellis at the pit stops was plainly a mistake, especially in Russell's case, and Mercedes says it confirmed its feeling the hard was still the right way to go based on Nicholas Latifi's Williams. That's right, the slowest car on the grid. When you consider how adept the W13 has been at managing tyres this season, surely the potential for Hamilton in particular to make the soft tyre work over a longer stint than predicted would have been obvious to Mercedes, especially knowing the track was improving and fuel loads dropping, making the cars lighter and tyre management easier as the race progressed. The fact the W13 generally trades gentler tyre warm-up in the early phase of a stint for better life towards the end should again have suggested going with the softer compounds would play more to Mercedes' inherent strengths, despite the lack of practice running to confirm this. But in the end, they locked themselves into a relatively short first stint on a slower compound, which then didn't give them the payoff of a late race charge on much fresher and faster rubber than the Red Bulls. Verstappen stretched his softs to the end of lap 25, Hamilton took his mediums only as far as the end of lap 29, Russell took his mediums not much further, in a 71-lap race. By not properly extending that first stint on mediums, Mercedes locked itself into a long final stint on the slowest tyre of all, a tyre that George Russell said just did not work from lap 2 onwards. Mercedes now thinks starting on softs would have been the better strategic play. But how exactly does that square with the fact Mercedes also argues it couldn't make the medium tyre last long enough? If the W13 couldn't do much more than 30 competitive laps on the medium, surely the soft was simply a no-go. You can't have it both ways. Graining, that is underheating of the tyre's core compared to its surface and then tearing apart the tread through sliding, is the problem Red Bull ran into with the soft, on the front left tyre specifically. Mercedes was always more likely to encounter this issue given its inherent gentleness on the tyres, so it therefore seems even more bizarre it opted to race with the harder compounds. If Mercedes was somehow degrading the tyres in a race where degradation wasn't really an issue for most cars, that suggests the team made a poor setup choice that massively compromised its race chances for the sake of qualifying higher up the grid. The team's feeling about how well the medium was holding up also contradicts what Russell felt inside the car at the time. He argued his pace on the medium was holding up well, so perhaps he could have turned the race around had he been allowed to extend that first stint. Maybe the car wasn't fast enough to win anyway. Certainly that's what Mercedes thought, but next year's might be, and if Mercedes then finds itself facing marginal calls that could make or break the race, making better and more agile strategic decisions in the heat of battle is going to become absolutely vital.